Okay, good.
Yeah,
So
and
it'll be a tag team thing. So I'm Janice Adams and I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy Remediation Redevelopment Division out of Gaylord. And the WICS TCE project has been my project for the last 20 years. So we'll go through our presentation, but we do have hot off the presses. You'll be the first one to receive it, our updated fact sheets, which I think we did in 19 and then maybe in 21 and then now again. So, and then I'll have my card, so I can pass these out for everybody, and if you want a card, but my contact information is on every page of this fact sheet, so they're easily to contact, so.
She can't get away. She can't hide.
Up on the EGLE website. This information's on the website, so if you need more copies, let me know, but if not, I can get you the digital and just go version too, so.
This is the.
I'm glad to see that it still points to my. You'll have to tell me to advance.
Okay,
And it's not our, and when it comes out, it's not our.
I think there's one that has like an animation.
Yeah, it sort of works.
Okay.
And I'll just leave these up here. Okay, I'll let you start and we'll go from there.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, my
Whatever.
name's Len Mankowski. I'm a geologist, work at WSP. We have an office in Traverse City. We're a pretty big company, kind of global, but we have a nice office of about 16 people here in Traverse City. We do a lot of work for Janice and EGLE in particular. I've been involved with the WICS Plume. Actually, it was my first day on the job was at the WICS site. So when we were drilling up by on Del Mason Road. So that was sonic drilling. We've got some pictures we'll show you. But I'm sure a lot of you guys are aware of the history of what we've done, but we'll bring some of that through as we come in just to kind of bring everybody up to date. So.
And I just wanted to add that the TCE Plume site is an orphan site, so there's no liable or even viable party out there. So the people that contaminated the facility out there was not Dura, it was prior to Dura. Nobody around, the companies are all defunct, so that's why the state has stepped in and made it, it's an orphan site, so that's why the state is paying for the cleanup. And extending the municipal water to everybody is because there's nobody else around to take care of that. So.
Janice and Linda, it's like we are recording this and be able. I'm gonna put it up on
Okay.
the website later, so we can. Talk
Okay.
Okay.
No one else is ever gonna hear it.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I just wanted to say it was an orphan site. That's why the state of Michigan is doing all the work out there. There's no liable or viable parties out there to take part in that. So with that, we'll start our presentation.
Yeah, you want to hit the next slide? Oh, yeah, Len Mankowski. Yeah.
Oh,
There.
so
And
I will, so since it's an orphan site, that's where I was going with that. So since it's an orphan site, the state of Michigan, I have about 400, 500 sites throughout northern Michigan that are sites of contamination. Most of them are liable party. There's somebody out there that's working on it, but a lot of them are not. And they're like this. And that's where Len's company comes in with our state PAC dollars that we're paying to clean up the site or to investigate the site. We can contract to them. So with them, I get a variety of experts from wetland personnel to chemists to a variety of people. So that's why we work as a team, so that their company has gone through a variety of different names. It's now WSP, but it's still the same people that have been working on it throughout all these years. There's more than 400 orphan sites. I alone have not orphan sites, but I have about 400 sites myself in northern Michigan. So I don't know how many orphan sites, but on our website, we have how many underground storage tanks, leaking underground storage tank sites, and how many other sites. And this is falls in the part 201 site. So.
Yeah, so just agenda wise, we'll run through a little background on TCE. We'll talk a little bit more about the history of the site, like Janice had alluded to. I want to talk about conceptual site models. That's kind of a framework for understanding contaminated sites in general, where you break things out into how do people or the environment potentially get exposed, right? And then that leads what you do, how you investigate, and here at the Wicks Plume, we kind of have three exposure pathways that we'll focus on, and it's groundwater, there's soil vapor. We'll talk a little bit about what that is, and those fact sheets that Janice handed out, I think there's some good information on the vapor intrusion pathway and what that is, and what we've done to investigate it. And then we'll talk about the Cedar River as well. So that's the agenda. And I guess the picture is because, we live up here for a reason. And right, so some of this is a downer, and like if we have the upside. Okay. No, I didn't. I should have iced it over. So you can see in the corner, we've got the site. It's the old Dura plant. This is a bit older picture when the plant was still there. And looking off into the distance, you can see Shush Mountain. I love this photo because that's pretty much giving us the pathway too for where that plume migrates. So so the origin was on the Dura property for the contamination that we talked about. And as you can see from the map, it's traveled an incredibly long way. This is one of the bigger plumes in the country, as far as TCE goes. We're blessed. It's partly because of the geology that we have here, that it's able to travel that far. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. So if we can move forward. And please feel free if you have any questions.
You said we're blessed, that it's part of the geology that's been able to build that fire. That's a good thing.
Well, I mean, we're blessed with the geology because it gives us hills and great, all of that great stuff. But as it turns out, it's kind of it allows the plume to really move. So, I mean, and here's a great place to talk about it, right? Trichloroethylene, also known as TCE. It's, and I'll refer to it henceforward as TCE because I stumble over that word every time. It's a man-made solvent. We have a lot of man-made chemicals, in the world. And so the man-made component creates an issue because there's not a lot of natural microbes that would typically embrace that type of chemistry, right? It's a unique chemistry that we've developed. So it's something that doesn't break down. It breaks down in the environment, but under certain conditions, right? And so the conditions in our aquifer are not conducive to its breakdown, right? There's too much oxygen. It likes low oxygen. The microbes that break it down need low oxygen scenarios. There's not a lot of carbon, so it doesn't get stuck because it was all sands deposited in front of a glacier. So not much carbon there, right? That was part of the soils. So that's kind of one of the problems, but it was used, it had a great purpose, which in terms of manufacturing, it's a great degreaser, and was used extensively. So we have it, in Michigan. It's pretty widespread. Most auto manufacturing, chrome plating. I mean, it's used in a lot of places. Yeah. And I think that's something that I think you appreciate more and more. We'll talk on the next slide about the regulations and the limits, but then to think about the workers that were actually working with the raw material, then that exposure is even, I think more significant. But it's a known carcinogen, but it also has some of these non-cancerous effects that are important too. And those are the non-cancer effects actually what drive the current limits on or the thoughts about vapor exposure, right? So the effects on the livers and the kidneys can be pretty severe, as well as the developmental in the fetus. So those are two issues that really push it. It is kind of on a, to nerd out, it's in its raw form when you just have it, it's denser than water. So one of the things you got to think about it, if you've got product, right? If you had a can of TCE and you poured it into water, it would sink to the bottom. So its behavior is a little bit different than something like gasoline, which will float on the top, right? This stuff goes down. So, but once it dissolves, once it starts to break off from that mass and mix with the water, it moves with the water, right? So it doesn't continue to sink anymore. Now it's going to flow with how groundwater moves. So
So there's a cap.
yeah, yeah, it will. And that is definitely one of the things that we look at. And so when we talk, you'll see some cross sections where it has worked its way into a couple of different systems. And so it makes the Wix plume very difficult to handle, both from its size and its depth, right? And what zones are impacted. So if we can go to the next slide. And and I will apologize if I start running slow. It's okay. Let me know. So drinking water, what's safe, right? Is, the federal and legal limit here in Michigan for groundwater is 5 parts per trillion, right? So it's or 5 parts per billion, sorry. Right. So and a part per billion is, 10 to the minus 6, if that help. I don't know. So anyway, well, I think I got another slide that'll help us with that. So it's fairly low. It's not the lowest, right? There's other things out there that are lower. But from the standpoint of drinking water, it's 5. When we think about things like the Cedar River, Lake Bel Air, Shanty Creek, the creek itself, the number there is 200 parts per billion is what's considered safe for like the mussels and all the little macros, the invertebrates along the bottom, that kind of thing that feeds that ecosystem. Vapor is the one that is kind of newish, about, well, I would say in 2011, we really started to think more and more about this pathway and realize that it's relevant. And it's where in the Wix scenario, we'll try to keep it specific. If you had TCE at the top of the water table, right, it's volatile, right? So when it'll move into a gas phase. And when it gets out into the atmosphere, it breaks down pretty readily with UV light. So, and ozone and oxygen that are present in the atmosphere. So it breaks down in the atmosphere pretty quickly. But if it gets into your building, right, it doesn't necessarily mix as well. It's not exposed to UV light, and we breathe it in and out. And that can be a problem. So when it's at the top of the water table, it can actually move from the water table into the pore space above it, the airspace in the soil, and then from there move into your building. And I'll show you some graphics to explain how that happens, because I think it's easier to see with a picture. But those have pretty low numbers, right? I mean, so when we think about screening levels for what's safe there, it starts at that 10 part per billion level. If you have, some space between your basement and the water table. But if that water table's actually in contact and you got to run a sump or something like that to keep from getting flooded, it can be as low as 0.07, right? So now we're starting to talk very small numbers. Well, we can skip ahead. I guess another important number that's put there is 67 micrograms per cubic meter. It's a little bit different unit, but that's when you're measuring TCE in the soil gas. That's a really helpful thing to know, right? Because just because it's in the water doesn't mean it can get into your building, right? But when we measure it in the soil gas itself, we have a much better understanding. Okay, it's moved from the water into the soil gas. We can start to really evaluate that pathway. Next slide.
You said that it's in water, so it's going to be down at the bottom of the aquifer. How does it get into the soil?
Because it starts at the soil.
Where, oh, the circle of the EPA route where if you own the property, you are now part of the group that has to clean the property up, where we have made it that if you didn't cause it and you purchased it and then did your proper documentation, your due, you know, your BEA, then you're not in the liability. You are,
Seem to naturally flow to all orphan sites. If you didn't have that, the exclusion, like, companies would be like, I'm out, bankrupting themselves, et cetera.
well, if you don't have the BEA exclusion because you've purchased it recently after that 95 magic number, and you don't have that BEA, then we get into settlements with them for just statutorily, they just didn't do their BEA. Now, are they responsible for the contamination? No, they did not do that contamination, but they didn't follow the proper work. So we do get in agreements with them to be able to, because we cannot have a liable party to be able to spend state funded money on them. So that's where that stands. There's Superfund still around, and that's a federal, that's the EPA, that's the CERCLA. So, right, and we never, the state never invited EPA in. We looked at that, but as soon as EPA would have came in, Dura would have shut down because they would have been part of the liability scheme, and they would have just said, we're done. So we kept it state in the state. So, and the process goes a lot faster in the state.
It does.
I
It's a
just
lot
think
faster.
us, which I know we're slow, but wow.
But Lake Tar Lake is a good example too, where that's still
Yes.
involved in Superfund,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so that's what it is.
Always run out of money. There are more sites that are available for super.
Yeah.
Oversight there.
But I guess, and then just to kind of run forward, right? So 2003 EGLE is, you know, I think then we were the DNR.
I have no idea. what
Yeah,
they
then,
are, but
like my company, the names change a lot. So, in 2011, you know, they demoed the plant. That caused us, that gave us an opportunity to do a little more investigation. And in 2024, I think a big one was, you know, the village of Mansalona, right, is now owning the property. They move forward, state helped them with the BEA, so that they've got that protection, and we'll be looking to support them as they want to develop that property. No, they just took it down to the foundation. The foundation's still there, the slab's still there. Yeah, it's those big presses, and yeah, there's some spots where it's really thick. Well, we'll talk about it, but we really didn't, there's still contamination present in the soil. But it's not, I mean, this is the whole problem with the WIC site, right? As I work on sites where instead of talking about part per billion levels, we're dealing with contamination in the part per million levels, right? And so that's something where there's a lot of mass and I can go get it, right? And the money spent makes a lot of sense. Here, concentrations are pretty low, right? I mean, but they're not low enough, but so, and the plume has already gone 6 miles away. Anything I do here isn't going to stop what's happening out there. So, so it's, yeah, tricky. Well, we can go to the next slide though. Kind of running through, right? So 2006, we did do some soil borings inside of Dura that while they were running, as well as, you know, key locations around the outside where we knew there was former lagoons, some of the things that we saw in that previous image, biased it towards where they had stored scrap metal outside, all of that stuff that might have been in contact with TCE. 2017, we were able to get in there and do it again. Now that the building was down, we did some geophysical as well, so we could look for, you know, is there buried drums in the ground? Is there anything that we might have missed, you know, when we could just do a quick little hole? We didn't find anything along those lines that jumped out as super significant. You guys may remember the when we did the seismic work, I don't know, we've driving along with that great big rig along every 5 feet, it'd stop and shake. Would do these kinds of things. That was fun. It was really cool. I'm a, you know, my yeah, my background was geophysics, so that was really cool. But you know, and it helpful. So but anyways, so we did that. We've done pumping studies at the well field, up at the Cedar River well field. We've done investigations not only in the river at the Cedar River, but you know, in the soils right next to it, where we do push point samplers, so we can see really close to the river, is TCE getting in at what levels. So we've done a lot of that kind of stuff, and then the vapor assessments as well, where we both look at groundwater and soil vapor to see, you know, where there may or may not be problems with or potential exposure. We hit the next slide. All right, so conceptually, this just a little cartoon. Conceptual site models often start with the simplest of cartoons. But what you try to capture is what's out there from an exposure, right? We have municipal wells, we have drinking water wells, we have people's houses and schools down gradient, we have the river, right? The surface water you can see on the left, and ultimately at the plant, we had TCE that was released first to the soil. And so to your question, right, we know that there's a little bit of that TCE that gets left behind. You ask any oil and gas guy, right? There's always oil in the ground. They sink a well, they pull a bunch of it out, but they can't get it all, right? There's little bits that stick inside in those pore spaces and tight spaces. And environmental releases are no different, right? So you got a little bit of TCE that gets hung up in the soil. It works its way to groundwater. Once it gets into groundwater, right, it can either sink deep, or if there's a lot of it, right, or if there's a little bit, it just tends to run. Right, depends how much you release and dissolve in that groundwater, go with the flow, for lack of a better word. Things like clays, right, are places where there's not a lot of groundwater movement, so you tend to get maybe a little bit of that TC might stick to that clay, but it's a little bit harder for it to move through that clay. So that's how, when we talk about different aquifers, you look for kind of here we have sands, then we have clay and silt. Those clay and silts, you know, they're kind of barriers. They're not perfect, but they're kind of barriers for flow. And then we get into more sand, right? And so as it turns out, as you can kind of see from the gray, right, more than one aquifer system is affected. It's both. There's some shallow, there's some intermediate, and there's some deep. So if we go to the next slide. Well, and that's one of the challenges too, right? Is you know, I've worked with a lot of folks from all over the country, and when I told one of my clients, I'm like, yeah, we got this site we're drilling, it's 250 feet to water. He's like, in Michigan? You got to be kidding me. There's no place that's 250 feet to water. I'm like, oh yeah. So when we're up by Shush or Shanny, you know, it's 200, 250 feet. But when we're down at the base, down by the lodge at Shanny, right? I mean, water is 5 feet, you know, so a lot of variation. So we have to use different tools and techniques throughout yeah.
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 It's the groundwater that's affected.
But you listen, but.
Well, it varies. So one of the things that I'll just, maybe I should, yeah, we'll yeah, here we go. So we can see it. So this one kind of shows, you know, maybe another cartoon, but a little more detail. The yellow is where the T, you know, depicting kind of, hey, here's where TC was released. You can see it move through and it hits the water table. And the water table, you know, is that top, that saturation zone. That's that blue line. When it gets into that water table, there wasn't really enough mass. It doesn't appear there was enough mass from the investigations that we've done that it went all the way down to that lower clay, right? It looks like it kind of disperses, gets hung up near the water table, creates what we like to call a smear zone, right? Where there's a lot of stuff bound up, but it's kind of right at the water table. Some of that contamination now is going to move with the groundwater flow, right? And some of it tends to stay along the top of the water table. And where it stays along the water table, we have that risk of it becoming a vapor, right? It can move from the water into this overlying soil. And that's kind of that red dash circle, pinky stuff. And that's what we worry about in terms of or investigate relative to buildings and things for that exposure. So there's the shallow plume shown in green. And then again, you have water moves laterally, but it always moves downhill, right? So there's that bit of a slope. So we have to watch. There's some, in particular, when you're further away from the river, a lot of times there's a gradient that actually is downward directed as well, right? So there's a bit of a flow that's, if this is more or less where the water table is, there's a net gradient that wants to move down and out, right? And so following that gradient, we have some impacts that get down into an intermediate zone and some into a deep zone. That's probably good. Let's move to the next one. Yes, the clay definitely makes it harder for it to move down. And likewise, once it gets under the clay, it'll be harder for it to move back up as well, right? And it's also a spot where sometimes it gets hung up a little bit. So even if you were to clean up in one area, then this becomes a source for longer, it'll take longer for it to clean up. We go back real quick. I think the smaller circle was just to highlight another exposure pathway. So that's where the plume itself isn't necessarily getting more rich, but it's now interacting with surface water, right? So now that's one of our focuses, right? So we got to focus on the vapor, we got to focus on the potential drinking water exposure and on the river. So.
Been a few years ago, but the comment was made that one of the meetings over in Arizona, that once that TCE hits the surface into the air, it dissipates and it's gone.
Yeah, it tends to break down. Yeah, it does not hang around in the Cedar River, right? So we know it gets into the Cedar River, but it's a very isolated stretch and it doesn't continue to move, right? With the river very far. So we sample where the plume is in contact with the river, right? And we will detect some TCE there. But because of the flow, right, it's turbulent, the ripples and all that kind of stuff, to your point, it helps it to move to the atmosphere. Once it moves to the atmosphere, it dissipates. So, and part of it's broken down, right? So the UV radiation helps to break the bonds. So, so you get some destruction. So that's good too.
But it's small, it's only small.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the levels too. Remember, there's a value. 200 is kind of that threshold where we start to worry about the health of the ecosystem. And we're staying way below that. So we'll hit that in a second. This is in the fact sheets as well. So, but this is a depiction of the vapor intrusion pathway. And so at the WIC site in particular, when we're thinking about, we tend to talk about the WIC site and has kind of two layers. One is when we're talking about the old Dura property, and the other is kind of talking about the plume itself, kind of give it both. But when we think about the property, right, where the TCE was left, it doesn't just follow. It's not like you dump it on the ground and there's a straw and it goes straight down, right? It plays plinko or whatever, kind of works its way through the grains this way and that. And so that's kind of what that orange shows. But then it can interact in different ways with our structures, right? And so it can follow sewer lines. It can follow, those are places where we have often disturbed the soil. We got nice, fresh, good, clean sand, right? Has a lot of openings in it. So if there's a gradient, it can flow along there. And that's when you can find penetrations into a building, follow sumps, things like that. So it's an important pathway for us to think about. And like I said, because of that vapor exposure, because we just breathe it and the amount that we would potentially breathe, it's definitely something that we look at from a very low level to make sure that we keep people safe. And it can get to you not only from what's been lost in the soil, but also movement from the top of the water table, right? So keep that in mind because that's part of why we do some of the investigation we do. Next slide. So this is this is just to give you a sense of how we investigate. Like I said, the first one on the upper left, that first photo, that's when we were using the rotosonic drilling rig, which was where you'd often, if 2007 timeframe, if you were driving around, you'd see that rig sitting there for like 4 weeks, right? It would take us almost a month to drill 500 feet down, right? So step away for a second, but when we were up on the hill, right, up by the Cedar River well field, 250 feet to water. Then we gotta look at water in the shallow zone, water in the intermediate zone, water in the deep zone. We were drilling over 500 feet to characterize TCE. So these were expensive wells. We were taking samples every 10, 20 feet along the way. Now that we've kind of got that definition of the plume, we can use mud rotary, which is the more typical, technique that people use to install their own residential wells. So it's a lot more cost effective. And we're in that mode where we're trying not to necessarily drill wells in the plume. We're trying to stay out in front of it with the new wells that we do. But the yellow zone in this particular depiction, especially in this area, this is the zone that the Cedar River Wellfield draws its water from, right? And I think the thing to point out, the green line, I know it's hard to see, is the groundwater plume, and this is based on, data. This is solid. That as cartoon is the last couple, I guess is what I'm saying. And you can kind of see that there's different forks and lobes, right? I mean, it's a very complex geology. There's a lot of silts and clays, those are the browns and the grays. And you can see that the plume tends to, it's not riding at the top of the water table, that blue line. It's about 50 to 100 feet below the water table is where the majority of the plume is moving, right? This is the shallow lobe. And this is the most expansive. It's moving the fastest there. You get further south. This is also the zone that tends to be where a lot of the residential wells were installed, right? The municipal wells are much deeper, getting into a much deeper aquifer system. But the residential wells, you're putting in a well, 50 feet below the water table's fine, right? I'm done. So a lot of the work that EGLE has done with supporting Mausa and the water expansion was because so many of these residential wells were right in that vertical pathway of the plume. So next slide. Yeah, let me know if am I running too late. So when you see these images of the big long plume, you're almost always looking at the shallow plume, right? Because that's the one that gets the furthest out. So don't think when you see this depiction, oh my gosh, it's right there at the Cedar River Wellfield. We're monitoring that separately. Okay, but when we show these ones, it's the shallow plume. So again, like I said, it's over 6.5 miles long. It's gone beyond Del Mason and it's gone beyond Shanty Creek into Summit Village area. And we've expanded, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but Mausa has expanded the water system into that area as well to kind of keep pace with that plume expansion. Next slide. Flow rates vary, right? So part of the reason that it's further ahead in the shallow system is because that's where groundwater moves the fastest, right? And it's all this glacial outwash. And so in that zone, we're looking at TCE migration rates, which will be a little different than groundwater flow rates because it's not perfect, right? It tends to get a little bit stuck on soil grains. It moves a little bit slower than groundwater. But empirically, we map when we get first detections, and we'll show you this. And based on those first detections, it's moving at about 300 to 400 feet per year. So it moves at a good clip. This is fast. Like a lot of the TCE plumes in the country don't move that fast.
Talking about what you were saying that, but that dog leg after the cedar, and you were saying it's because it's towards like Bel Air, and it's like getting water flows down gradient into that.
Right.
Right.
Well, and the good news is that you can kind of see it's taken another dog leg again, right? And so that dog leg appears to be, right? And so Shannon Creek's got a nice flow, right? And things move along pretty good. So like we were talking about earlier, yeah, and it's moving into a part where we're tending to move more under a lot less homes, right? And so, yeah. Next slide. So again, just kind of staying ahead, what do we do kind of now, right? Is we've installed, let's see, 2022, we put some more wells into the Summit Village area so that we can get good control and see just how that plume is moving and verify what everything has been telling us to date is that it's probably going to that Shanty Creek area. And so we can shoot ahead of this one. Speaking of Shanty Creek, so one thing that we did do is do some profiles across the creek and measure how flows change. And by doing that, we realized that between the pond on the legend and I don't know if you guys know, there's that, if it has a name or not, there's that little dirt road that goes back there and goes across. There's the cart path runs through from
Like
Old
Trail or
Cabin
something,
Trail.
or something.
it is the
Anyway,
coolest,
yeah.
was such a cool spot, right? Because when you go from, is it hole 6 to hole 7? I can't remember. Along the cart path, you'll just see the water flowing out of the side of the hill. Right? I mean, it's like a vertical wetland and the huge cedars down in there. It's a really neat spot.
Tell them about installing the well.
Well, yeah, we tried to put a well in about where that black arrow points. It's SB 117. And the head, when we hit the aquifer, the pressure down there, the water wants out so bad, right? And we gave it a straw. It shot 7-10 feet up into the air, right? So needless to say, we didn't put a well in there. Let's plug that. Whoa. But it, confirmed what we were seeing. And then blue zone here that's shown on this map is an area where we seem to have pretty high hydraulic conductivity, meaning it's an easy groundwater flow, for lack of a better, low resistance to flow, right? So groundwater tends to move into places with high hydraulic conductivity. And it really is coinciding with how it looks like that plume is starting to bend, right? So multiple lines of evidence telling us the plume's going to Shanty Creek. We can go to the next slide. Oh, this is the one that shows, this kind of shows how the plume has changed through time. And so what we do to estimate those migration rates is look at, where was it first detected and when, right? And that'll give us both an understanding of how it's moving in the down gradient direction this way, as well as how fast it's expanding, right? So, I mean, I think one thing to capture as you look at this figure is the plume width is pretty wide where it's been there for a while, right? So it's moving this way, but it spreads as it goes.
Len, can you work on that screen?
Oh,
everybody
yeah,
can see?
sorry. So it moves as it goes. So in the early stages, it's kind of moving in this real narrow front, right? But the rest of this plume is going to catch up and it's going to continue to have a little bit of dispersion this way as it expands out. So we know that this plume width is going to get wider, starting to see it here, right? Starting and back here, it's much wider. So at some point, this will be a much broader plume. But part of it is also going to be fed how quickly it can get to the surface water, right? And that'll also help define its geometry. I think the moral of the story, though, is part of the reason we needed some of those wells, if you noticed on that last one, and we were setting them away from the plume axis as well, so that we can have that handle and we can have that understanding. And really make sure that it's continuing to move, 300 to 400 feet. That's an average, right? And it's based on what we measure empirically, but you can get faster zones that allow water to move a little bit faster, that kind of thing. So those are all stuff that we look at as we do our investigations and move forward.
Straw example. There is. the exposure to air dilutes it. So why wouldn't we just upstream, put that water, have a spillway of some sort, and then the TCE concentration comes out, and that spillway would be injected or something.
We did different things, and not only with the state of Michigan and Lens Group, but we also worked with Michigan Tech, and then we worked with the University of Detroit. And there's a lot of things that could be done out here, but that would not right now with the one is cost. It's so costly. There's no way we could afford that. But you have clean, safe drinking water. So even if you were to do those things, it would take a lifetime to ever clean up. In the meantime, the groundwater is still going into water. So, but it's a costly thing. TCE is a very easy thing to clean up if your plume is 500, 600 feet. Not if it's over 6 miles long and 500 feet deep. So might be able to help that, but you're not going to help the risk. And we are a risk-based program. And right now the risk out here is the drinking water is our risk out at the site. We want to make sure everybody has safe, clean drinking water.
See, that seems right. So if you want to do anything without water, some of the things that we looked at, and we pump this water up, run it through an air stripper, right? And then create a new stream that just goes back. And I can't remember what it cost, but it was.
So some of the technologies
Yeah.
we looked at, even Bob Wagner, 10 years ago, he threw out an estimate of 13 trillion gallons of water. Well, if we could do it at half a penny a gallon, we still, there's just, the cost is overwhelming. And not only is it overwhelming, it would be all of our lifetimes combined before it would ever be cleaned up. So that's why the risk right now is drinking water. And that's what we want to do is provide safe drinking water to people. In the meantime, we got a handle on where's it going? Who's going to be impacted next? That's why we do all the investigation. And is it impacting any more of our surface waters? And then we're going to talk a little more about the VI and all the systems that we have for the VI in some of the buildings. So those are our 3 things that we're doing. But yeah, if the plume was 500 feet long, we would be able to clean this up.
Right.
And actually clean it up, but you know, it's, yeah.
Right.
We're just waiting for it to hit Shannon Creek and diffuse. Why won't we get up there and all that?
Yeah, that's, yeah, it's, yeah.
Oh, so one of the Cedar Creek, because we're just heading towards Cedar. Creek.
All right.
The well field, the well field.
Yeah.
And towards the well field and then of course series of wells,
Mhm.
variated, maybe even use it for making snow. I mean, that was one of the ideas.
Yep, it was, yes. Yep.
But part of what happened is you would have to put in so many wells, and then plus it started doglegging and going in different directions, so it just.
Right.
And you're gonna run that in a system like that for 100 years.
Yeah, 100 years.
So,
And-
so you're gonna
and-
pay my kids, and my kids' kids, to keep running that system.
Yeah, well, it's just the
maintain it.
sheer volume of the thing.
Yeah,
It's like, the parts per billion thing, it's like, it'd be like, a single regular drinking straw in a swimming pool. I
Mhm.
mean, it would take for.
right.
It costs so much, right? Back to a comment though, somebody might have mentioned about the irrigation for the Cedar River well or Cedar River for snow and for, golf course irrigation. The state of Michigan's been in an agreement with Shannon Creek since, 2006 maybe. So a long time, almost 20 years. And they sample quarterly where they extract that water. Right now, they're extracting from Cedar River, but before they had irrigation wells. And then they sample that and they send us a report. So 4 times a year. And every time they've done that, it's always been non-detect.
Yeah,
So,
we've never had a
but-
conversation.
Online warrior.
Oh, good.
Somebody was asking, what about the snow
Right.
that they're making, is that impacted, and I didn't have. the answer.
And I just got that question a couple weeks ago. So it might be the same person. Yes, that Yes, called in a panic because they just realized, they probably just realized like, oh my gosh, I'm out here skiing and they're making snow. Yeah, and then all connected to them and then, yeah, so,
Well,
yeah.
this- I bought my house in '04 and we
Mhm.
specifically bought where we did because it was going to the cedar.
Right, right?
And now I'm deferred.
Okay.
Okay,
Oh, you're
yeah,
right.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm Shannon Creek Road.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Great. But there's no way to predict.
No.
When it,
We have a handle, we have a good handle of prediction of where it's at based on all of our information.
Yeah.
If four very limited, and four, that was right when the state was taking over from Dura. And we were just in, at that time, we didn't even, at that time, we thought the plume ended way back here. Way
Yeah.
back there, because that was our last monitoring well, so therefore it ended right there.
It wasn't
was-
until it
yeah.
showed up in the Sudendorf wells
Mhm.
at Shanny that they were like, oh, whoa, or a shush, yeah, where they were like, oh, that got away. And so, but a lot of that early stuff in the late nineties was just based on what we could get, what we could understand from people's wells, right? So we didn't have all the. Some of these locations, when we were doing the rotosonic drilling, it was $100,000 just to set up on that location and get, samples profiled down to 550 feet, right? And those guys were leaving 6, 8. There's one spot on Zwischendorf Trail where, I mean, there's a lot of steel in the ground right there. There's a lot of stuff like it would screw up your magnet and probably your compass.
Feet deep.
Yeah, hundreds of feet deep and they could not get it out. So, but if we go to the next one. Yeah. Oh, that,
Yeah,
Well, not in other areas that have that effect.
yeah. So most of the water, perfect timing, right? So most of the water comes
The other
from
side.
the wells, the wells to the east of Manzalona, right? So up gradient, Plume is here, groundwater is flowing that way. These are well removed from the impacts of the TCE. And that supplies the majority of the water in the Mausa system. They are still using the Cedar River well field for a limited portion. The folks that are up basically along Troon Road, that high area, those folks still receive it. But there's been a couple of things that we'll talk about infrastructure wise. So they're not dependent on that water. They don't necessarily need to keep going. So if for some reason it shows up there someday, right, there's an alternative already in place. We have some redundancy, which is nice.
That's over in Minnesota.
It is, yeah,
So they could fill it with that water.
yes.
exactly. Yeah. And then they've also got a really big storage tank as well. So that provides that opportunity to store water and stay ahead of the curve. Oh, I don't know what the number, but Jim McQuarrie would tell you. I know, back in the day, we had and it's probably become more, but there had been over 1,400 properties affected, individual properties. And that's probably, no, well, yeah, where the plume's underneath. Yeah, so, and that's definitely grown. We haven't kept up since but the pink there, right? This is the area that you can see, some nice hard lines, regular. That's the area where the health department steps in. So there's kind of a couple steps, right? We're doing monitoring on behalf of the state, and the state's helping to fund water line expansion as a way to make sure that folks don't have bad drinking water. The health department provides an institutional control. They have a permitting system. If you want to put in a new well, you got to follow their well first permitting program, right? So usually they'll call Janice, and then Janice and I will look at an individual location, what depths, would be concerned about whether or not they could, by pumping, maybe draw the plume towards them, right? So there might be some shallow depths. Remember, we talked about it being 50 to 100 for the shallow plume, and then whatever. So there might be some depths that we could recommend if you're going to put in a well. This is a safer depth, and a preferred depth. They go out, they drill the well, they verify that that's good, they have to sample, and then until they confirm that it is free of TCE, they don't get the well permit. They can't actually use it for drinking water. So the health department's very involved in that permitting process, which is a little bit unique for Northern Michigan. But it's just one of those pathways that helps to make sure we stay safe. And they revised that. Their last revision was in 2018. And you can see there's a pretty big buffer around the toe of the plume right now. So if we go to the next slide. So again, it's staying in front of the plume, making sure people have safe water. In the past, and Janice, you might want to speak to this. In the past, the way that we had operated was, when there was a detection in somebody's water, EGLE would usually step in with bottled water and that kind of thing, and that opened the door for us to expand the water system. There's since been some changes, right, that allowed us to be supporting with EGLE a little more proactive and trying to get in ahead of the plume and get, we know where it's going. Can we get the folks on drinking water before we have to wait until there's an actual detection?
Yeah, I can speak on that. And then
Yeah.
what happened was, that's usually how it was before. We had a detection, did not have to be that 5 parts per billion, just had to be a detection. And then we would get money, I would get money from Lansing, work with MASFA, we would get engineering plans, extend the municipal water. Well, we knew it was coming into this Summit Village area. It was there. We had already extended water down Duskin Road to Windy Hill in that community. And we thought, hey, it's coming. And it takes, 18 months to 2 years to get engineering plans together, get it bid out, get water so people can drink. It just is it takes a long time. So I thought, well, let's extend the municipal water right there. Approach. Phase 1. We had Cheney Creek, Summit Village, to be able to get permission to come onto their property. They'd already granted it on Windy Hill, but they did not want us coming in and extended water. Finally, with working with them about 1.5 years later, which remember we tried to be proactive, now we're right back on the same scheme. Now we're getting people that are on Wind Ridge that actually had impacts to the drinking water wells. They didn't have to be because we were there, but so we placed them on the bottled water immediately, and then we extended the municipal water. So in that phase 1 and phase 2 approach that finished up last 2020. Everybody that had a parcel in front of their home, it was the extension was stubbed out to the end. So if they're going to build later, they can hook up. If you had a home, everybody extended, everybody abandoned their monitor or their drinking water well, and we provided drinking water to them, all but 2 people. 2 people out of all those people, they refused. They did not want to. They wanted to stick with their drinking water well. So at that time, and they have every right to do that. So at that time, they chose to do that. I took them off our monitoring plan because we monitor everybody that's in that neck of the woods. Once we have a buffer zone and keep extending it. So we've already had a avenue to provide safe drinking water to them, that if they want to monitor, they're going to have to do that themselves, because that's just double dipping in the state of Michigan's cost. We've already providing a service, and we feel that that's the safest service, is to have safe drinking water. So that's where we're at there. The health department helps us out. They sample in areas 3 and 4 in that area, around that area. So they're sampling yearly. Right now we have everybody's on yearly sampling. And if anything comes with a trace, we immediately sample again. And then if we came up with something, then at that point we would our engineering plans together, working with Jim and his group there, getting it to be able to bid it out and working with the association at that point because it's all in their association. So with this last phase 1, phase 2, not only did we do extensive infrastructure for the drinking water, we also had to replace a lot of roads out there for them because if you know, as y'all know, there's no shoulder to put your utilities. So they got new roads too. So I think it worked out well. It was quite a project. Good, thanks.
The original water tower from that well, was there any concern about that?
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, we've worked a lot. So, I don't know if you remember, so at the end of the, oh, now I'm doing exactly. At the end of Forest Trail, they come down here and then there's that Pinebrook condos and everything. Few years ago, their well, they had their own private drinking water well. It was broken. It was, so it was in that well first area. So could they have drilled a new well? Probably, and it probably would have definitely came up clean, no impacts. However, at this point, we weren't sure, some years ago, we're thinking it's making a beeline right there, so they're gonna spend all that money in the infrastructure on doing that. And then 4 years, 5 years later, it's gonna get impacted. So at that point, the state did pay for condos to get hooked up to that Cheney Creek, the well with the water tower. So and that's Watar's, it's not Moscow, it's Watar's water. But then your question was, so once the Plume started going more to that westerly component, now even a little southwesterly little hook, that took that off, because we thought it was gonna hit. That's,
Yeah.
we were gonna probably pass the Cedar River well field, but we're probably definitely gonna hit the water tower up there, just because the type of geologies that's up there. There was a lot of confining layers, a lot of sand, but then it started turning to the westerly component. But we have monitoring wells out there by that, water structure up there,
Yeah.
just to double check on everything on that.
As like in 2007,
Yeah.
as we started to expand into the Del Mason, Shanty Creek area, that was like the next step. So we had put, there's it's the road commission building down in that low spot on Shanty Creek. We put a well there. So between, well downgrading to the Plume, but between the Plume and the Shanty Creek well field, because we know they pull a lot of water. But that one slide I showed earlier about the Cedar River, or I'm sorry, Shanty Creek itself, the flow into Shanty Creek between the pond and that boring that we saw water shooting out of the sky, right? That's getting 3,200 gallons a minute flowing into there, right? And at Shanty Creek, they pump at a combined rate off of their wells at the most at 1,000 gallons per minute, and for about 3 to 4 hours at a time. We've done some transducer studies, so we kind of know what their pumping looks like, right? And it pales in comparison to what is happening at that creek, which is great news. And to be honest, first blush, looking at that creek, we're like, it's not that much flow. It can't be that significant. So it wasn't until we measured it, and we were like, well, okay.
So we did some transducer studies out there just to see what the Cedar River well field was. Sort of, we all know they pump more in the summer than they do in the winter because residents are there. But that was one reason why we went in with the county. County gave some money, and then the state of Michigan gave the rest of the money to put that storage tank there, so that we wouldn't have that huge sucking of the straw all at one time, especially if it was a fire, a big resort fire, say, and you had to really get a lot of water through their system out there. We wouldn't be drawing the TCE Plume into their Cedar River well fields. So that was another twofold for having the storage tower. Storage tank.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to forget when you pump water, you create a new direction for flow, right? So that's part of the reason that well first area is as big as it is, right? To make sure, in particular, if somebody wants to come in and put a high capacity well, right? That's the one that requires us to really sharpen our pencils and think about. Most residential wells, they're fairly small volume. You start putting a lot of residential wells together, well, that can create a different picture. And I think, phase 1 and phase 2, sorry, guys, I'll go over here. Phase 1 and phase 2, we're because we already had this area covered. We knew the Plume was at the corner here. right? And so phase one and phase two, really thinking about priority. Obviously, we don't want to inconvenience people. That was why we're doing it in that phase process, right? That's highest likelihood.
So, but like I say, the health department helps us out yearly, but we knew there were certain wells in here, especially on Windy Ridge Drive. We knew that, I mean, just where they're screened, they're gonna get hit.
Yeah.
So we were sampling them monthly. And they got hit.
Yeah.
But, you know, we were ready once finally they granted us the access to be able to come to the association, then we could hook everybody up. So.
We used to joke that, I forget her name, but she could show up to do a water sample, like, oh, it's a water lady, she did present the.
Well, and the last point here, I think, is that the work isn't done, and to your concern too about, how connected are we? So, there's a high pressure line that will run up, to just the east, right, up where Frog Hollow is. And that will connect the wells from Mansalona to the Cedar River well field, so that if for some reason the Cedar River well field ever had a problem, they can draw all the water directly from Mansalona. So that it's that backup, right? That redundancy and supply and making sure that we can stay safe. So that'll be EGLE funded that.
Yeah,
For
we just
2025?
got the funding in August. The Mossville water people are getting the engineering plans. So hopefully by spring it'll be bid out and they'll be able to do that. So. So it'll go past where the lumberyard is, old lumberyard, up through that area. And then the area, like you said, Dalmatian and when Shana Creek curves by the church, those homes there, some of those weren't connected yet. They'll all start getting connected there. But what it really is for that what if the Cedar River gets impacted. Well, the Frog Hollow, we already extended water down that road. He just used that, but we did extend water down there to the 3 or 4 residents. That's there, just there to those residents. Because once what we were talking about, that pancaked area, they were probably gonna get impacted here shortly. So yeah, that's where that's at.
And
So-
one of the big parts is it's that high pressure, right? So it can help we need that pressure to be able to get that flow from Mansalona up the hill, right? So a lot of it's transmission, and then there will be some service branches too. Right. Not especially with Mauser stuff, right?
I,
And
I
that's,
don't know about the historical in the village of Mansalona. I'm not, because their system is old. I don't know.
90s, isn't it? 90s.
Even a long time ago.
Okay. See, it's some of that older stuff potentially,
Yeah.
but from the age perspective, that's kind of there's differences.
Down the road, you got some of those rural roads, pretty much alone and getting creepy, you see fire hydrants.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that is an upside, right? Is that, most folks, like, I don't have any kind of fire hydrants. I live between Travers and Sutton's Bay. I don't have,
Too.
and that helps. I mean, there's a bit of an offset. Yeah, it does affect your insurance for sure. So, you got a water bill, but your insurance goes down. So, this is kind of just going through, an example, of a property where, they wanted to put in a residential well, kind of close to the Plume. And, we worked with, the health department, looking at old geologic logs, to kind of assess where we thought that, a safe location depth wise for that well would be. And we work great with Casey and they've got a great staff. So next slide. Okay, so the vapor intrusion pathway, look at the pink in particular, right? So this is where you have the TCE occurring near the water table. Right at the top, and it can move into that vapor phase. And there are 2 areas where we tend to be concerned about this. In particular, it's near the site, in the Mansalona area where that plume is kind of dribbling along with the water table before it starts to drop and dive down a little bit following the gradients. And then again, when that plume comes back up closer to the Cedar River. So in those areas where along the Cedar River, some of the wetlands in that area, we do a lot of soil vapor. That's where we look for soil vapor. So we kind of break it into two categories. If you look at some of the EGLE reports that are available, you'll see stuff about source area VI, and VI is kind of the vapor intrusion, right? So source area VI and down gradient VI. When we talk about down gradient, that tends to be focused in the lows, right? So near Shush Mountain, near the base of Shush Mountain and the Cedar River there, and then back at the source. So we can go to the next slide. So, you know, we've done a pretty good amount of work around the old Dura building. There's definitely a soil vapor concern below that property, right? So in terms of any construction, future construction that would occur on that property, you got to take it into account. There are engineering ways to keep it safe, right? So you can put a barrier down that doesn't allow, you know, like a rubber or permeable or impermeable barrier, or foams. There's some spray foams you can use. And God knows what chemicals those might contain. But there are those measures. Another, even maybe it's a mechanical system, but it's called a subslab depressurization system. So basically what you do is you take a vacuum and you remove air from below the slab, right? And so if you think about everything follows gradients, there's a low air pocket of air pressure below your building, and your building has a higher pressure. Any vapor movement is actually going to be from your building down into the ground, right? That's the goal. So we want to make sure vapor movement, if it's occurring, is going down as opposed to up and into my house, right? And so that what this shows is based on our work, right? We look at Iron Skillet, we look at Shirley's, at the hotel. We had Michigan Roots. And when we did our investigation, we did find some potential for vapor intrusion to occur. Doesn't mean that it was occurring, but it was high enough risk, right? And so EGLE installed 3 of those subslab depressurization systems in those buildings for those folks. So that makes sure that the TCE can't move into the building or anything else that might be down there, right? And they built the systems for them, gave them the means to monitor, and now that's the responsibility of the property owners. So they now own it, right? It's part of their property at this point. And, you know, going back to that BEA idea, when we buy property, even if it's contaminated because of somebody else, if we're going to run a business, we have a due care obligation to make sure that folks that come into our business aren't exposed to something, right? And so in a lot of respects, this is a due care obligation. Here, the state's been pretty proactive to do that for those businesses. So it's been, we're lucky to have Janice. It's really what it boils down to. So we go next slide. This kind of gives you a cross section at the site, thinking about the old plant. You can see where the black boxes are where we have some soil samples that help define where there are some low levels of TCE still in the soil. Some of it's up shallow, some of it down below. And this is below the old seepage lagoon, which there are stories about them throwing dynamite in once in a while because it would clog up and they had to improve the drainage, right? And so that's probably why you got a pulse of TCE going through, but also probably why we don't have a lot of product, right? This was stuff that was sitting in a, you know, mixing with water, so it wasn't a separate phase. So good and bad, this little stuff are just little pockets of gravel, the little lenses that you see in there. And they're kind of drawn to look like a river channel because this is all water is flowing out of a glacier. The light blue down below, that's the TCE that you can see in the aquifer system, and you can see wells that are impacted, right, with TCE near the water table. And as we move further down gradient, right? The concentrations at the water table are going down. Doesn't mean that the plume's going away. In this instance, the plume is diving a little bit as it moves away, because there's a component of flow, right? That isn't just this line, it's a little bit down as well. So, so when we think about the vapor intrusion pathway, folks that are close to the building, to the green, as well as folks that are over where the blue contamination is in contact directly with the sands above. These are the zones that we need to look for, to investigate to see if there's potential for vapor intrusion. The crazy thing about it all is that, our houses aren't perfect, they breathe. We warm them up. Today's a great day to think about it, right? Outside it's cold, dense air, right? Inside it's nice and warm, light air. Our warm air rises, right? So we're losing some air out of our building. So it's got to be made up. So if we have good windows, right, and good seals, maybe we don't get too much of that stuff coming in, but it's got to be made up. So that's when we worry about it coming up from below. And they call that the chimney effect. So buildings can create kind of a chimney effect, right? And so that's what we see at some of those properties. That's why we see that plume the way we do for the properties across the street from the dirt, right? And that's why we need a sub-slab system. It's really that chimney effect. So it wasn't like it was a concern year round, but in the winters in particular, it becomes more of a concern. So we can go to the next one, because you guys are probably, so the down gradient area, again, is where that plume is starting to come up, right? And interact with wetlands, that groundwater is coming up and feeding those wetlands, that groundwater is coming up and feeding the Cedar River, right? And as it moves up, it's bringing the TCE that it has in it as well. So that's the area where, we have shallow groundwater. We put in a lot of wells to really look just at the top of the water table. If TCE is present, then we can also install the soil gas probes so that we can actually measure what's in the soil gas, because that's how we really know. We have a much better handle on whether it could move into a building, right? Measure the gas itself. The water tells you you should look, then you do the soil gas so that you know. And the good news is that we have seen some low level TCE and some PCE in some of these wells, PCE in particular, which is a dry cleaning thing and isn't necessarily associated with the plume. So the PCE is a little unusual. But we haven't had any detections of TCE in the soil vapor in 2023 and 2024. We go out there about once a year and sample the soil gas so that we get different seasonality, right? Because in the winter, yes, below a building, it can be bad, but the best time to gauge it is when that water is nice and warm, right? Because the warmer the groundwater, the easier it is for TCE to develop, right? Off of the groundwater, move into the vapor space. So we tend to see concentrations be higher in the summer, right? But they're more mobile in the winter. They can move a little easier. So, oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. So, this is the base of Shush over here. This MW31R is like just outside Ivans, right? Nice big building, chimney effect. So we definitely want to look there, right? So we've never had a detection at that location.
There's a lot of swigglies and I couldn't run.
Yeah, and then it's blown up a little bit, so it gets weird, but you got West Shush Mountain Road right here, right? Okay. Thank you. I know. And then we do, monitoring every year. And we've tended to go spring, fall. We're probably gonna go more towards fall moving forward because we haven't had any detections, and it's nicer to sample in the fall. So much better season board. But what we do, you can see here, this is a little push probe up in the pond there. So this actually was a sample that we took along M88, kind of along Saloon Creek. So we do this at different locations. But it's just a little slender point. We can shove it down in below the water surface and get it down below. We monitor to see like, what are the oxygen levels like? Do they look like the pond or are they something different? So make sure we're getting that water that's moving into that surface water body. So we call those pore water samples. They're really groundwater samples in these instances, but they're not a formal well and they're just a grab sample. But we go get those, and we sample the river itself. We do 2 actually pore water samples next to each of our river sample locations, slightly different depths. So that gives us a sense of what's venting, as well as we have monitoring wells that we're looking at and things like that. All of those data, right, to see what are the concentrations like going into the river. To date, we haven't had anything exceeding the 200 ppb threshold. EGLE also does, about every 10 years, about every 10 years or so, a little different division comes up and, you know, they run through with the nets and they get macro invertebrates. They look at the diversity, the counts to see what the river health is. And it's always scored. They do it in this area as well, with plume vents as well as upstream. And the diversity and ecology scores, right, for the river are still solid, right, really good. So it doesn't appear that there's a detrimental effect there from the plume venting. And like we were talking before, it is nice because it's ending and it's not moving to the other side of the river and impacting more folks. So if we go to the next slide. Well, that's just one potential source. Yeah, it could have been a dry cleaner but PCE is hard, right? I mean, we tend to associate it with dry cleaners. It's in your little brake cleaner squirt bottles, right? And you know, this was such a good cleaner, right? And back in the 50s, you clean your toilets with it, you know, you do all kinds of stuff with it. It put a shine on anything. And I think we're done. I'm sorry for taking so long, but this will give you a sense on the website there. You can see this image will come up. Basically, every place that we sample, whether it's a residential well, monitoring well, whatnot, all of that data is available. You can zoom in, you can see parcel boundaries, you can click and understand what's the groundwater elevation, what's the TCE concentrations, has it ever been detected? That information is all available there.
And it's on the fact sheet. This is probably the last page or one of the last page, the link to this. And it's also on our website. So.
Yep. Individual wells. So like, I mean, the idea, the goal was, right, too, is this something for your buyer? You're moving to the area, right? Get to know it, zoom in a little bit, see, you know, is there history that you can learn about your property? So.
You mentioned earlier about vertebrates. I assume it's not, adversely affecting the fish population.
Yeah, no,
And then there's so much, it's kind of overwhelming, it's not kind of, it's overwhelming, but if you go north of this side, there's potentially more site, this is a heavy manufacturing area. And are we studying any other additional sites or properties with this?
Right, like in Central Lake, we have sites and every place has, every community, not only had your leaking underground storage tank sites, all your old gas stations, everybody had a dry cleaners or 2 or 3. Mile, we had 4. So a lot of those sites either are either they're historic and they're just on the books and nobody's doing anything. Most likely they're orphan sites, no viable parties around. So we have other programs. It just started in the last couple months. We have a dry cleaning triage program. So we're going to come in and start working on some of those old dry cleaner sites.
The state, by virtue of setbacks or right of ways, owns a lot of that too, in terms of lost site or things like that. Where it was, the roadway was obviously in front of the gas station, isn't there a? home run?
Well, if we're if we're going to leaking underground storage tanks, that's a bizarre thing. You buy the property, you own the tank. It doesn't even matter about that causation stuff that I was talking about. So if you go down and say you bought a residential home and you didn't know it was a gas station site before, and there's tanks on it, you now are responsible for that. So it's, yeah, due diligence. You got to do your homework before you purchase something. So. Yes, oh, yes, heating oil tanks, yes. The only difference between a heating oil tank and a storage tank that was used like petroleum at a gas station is the heating oil tank doesn't fall under that part 213, like I was telling you with all those timelines. That gets thrown back into our 201 program. I know life's weird and there's no sense. You can't really, oh, we get this. It doesn't make sense, but it's because, and it ties into petroleum products being sold commercially, you know. Yes. Yes. The fact sheets are wonderful for the public, but they are a wonderful asset for me because I do get 3 to 4 property transaction questions a week. I want to sell, I want to buy. Oh my gosh, I just bought, I had no idea, you know, because if you look under Google Maps and Mansalona pops up, it talks about the TCE Plume in that. They're like, I just purchased, you know, that, so it works so good. And like I said, working with the health department is wonderful. Working for Jim and his group down there, it's a good team. We've got a good thing going here. Everybody is works well together. Yes. Well, I think the fear factor dissipated once again with a knowledge of these fact sheets that either everybody can look at it their own, not just the presentation you're coming to. Now you got something you can look at. And I have at not Kip County building up until your remodel, but at the libraries, township halls, the report, so that we do a yearly report on we sample the groundwater twice a year, do a one report at the end. So the groundwater sampling twice a year, the vapor will be touched on a little in that. And then the surface water sampling that we do once a year is all in the report. So I have those available for people to grab or you can get it electronic. I can send it that way easy. But I think the biggest reason why we don't have the fear is because we have the majority of the people hooked up to municipal water. Remember the years before, 5 Corners, before that was done, there was a huge amount of people that just, had bottled water or that, we just don't know what was happening. So I think that's helped the fear factor.
And
They're still stupid comments.
right,
Oh, yeah,
7, right, in that time frame, and we're hooking everybody, the
Mhm.
state's doing all the hookups in Del Mason and that way. And we're saying the plume is going, it pointed right at the Cedar River well field.
yes.
Right, and at that point, the Cedar River well field was serving a lot more folks than it is currently. And it was supposed to have been installed as the replacement safety net for the Sudendorf wells, right? But at that point, the understanding of flow wasn't there. We didn't have enough points in the ground to really understand the situation. Now that we see it bending away from the Cedar River well field too, I think that's definitely given a lot of other folks, some reassurance.
15 years ago, we had this meeting, the room would have been packed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, this
Yeah.
venue, these types of opportunities, I think have been
Yes.
critical as well. Like when the Cube was meeting, when we were going to those, being
Right.
able to discuss and be open is really important.
Yeah, Q was good, and then we did have a meeting, November, it must have been 2022, before the last phase 1, phase 2 went in. And that was hosted by Custer's Township, they hosted that, and we came, and I think that was a good meeting, because the majority of the people that came said, I live right here, what are you doing for me? And that's why I like public meetings, other than this stuff is great, but public meetings are good too, because then they say, I live here, what are you gonna do for me? And you just have a better handle of the people and a face too. That works out good, but nope, it works out good. I've only been denied one time on asking to put put monitoring wells in on a site. And this is a long time ago, and the guy says, this is a long time ago, so 20 years ago, before technology was there, and he says, my brothers and I own this piece of property, can you move across the street? I own that solely. but my brothers are in Italy. So, you know, we would had to send it over there, their attorney. So I'm like, yeah, I can move it across the street. But other than that, everybody works really well on letting us put our infrastructure in and getting on their site to be able to sample, or letting Casey in to be able to sample their drinking water wells. That's wonderful too. So,
And to circle back on your question about the, number of locations, a lot of the ways that we find new sites is through transactions, right? So the fact that we have the BEA process here in Michigan as a way to insure yourself against, right? It's a good investment, but that is also the way that we tend to find sites. So the state isn't in a position where they just randomly go, I want to put we think you're a bad actor. We want to put something here. We can't, that's not how it goes, right?
Folks put some frogs on the pond and stuff like that, but I grew up in Muskegon and I had lagoons like that for oil.
Right.
Just nothing lived in there. You just
Yeah.
accepted it. So the standard over the last 50 years is.
Oh, yeah.
has changed remarkably, so therefore you're doing more monitoring.
Right.
Ways to fix it. So I did that, but the dangers in what you don't know.
Right.
So like the rail beds, you know what, there's a lot of other manufacturing facilities that haven't turned. Or they, I'm amazed people buy stuff when in contract, so
Right.
swap. I looked at a property for our family. I was like, no, because I knew that.
Right.
And the guy that bought it didn't care. So
Right.
I just bought it.
and that's what's good too, is the BEA process, because most financial institution, if you're going in for a mortgage or a loan from them, they're like, we need to have the BEA. And that's where we, like Len said, that's where the state of Michigan finds out so many properties that, you thought it was just a little house down the corner, or vacant field. Oh, that vacant field was something in the 40s. And this is what this was something in the 40s. So,
But like the bus. Apps like that in finance. So
yeah,
Right.
right. Yes.
That's obviously there's TCE Plume, but then there's is there anything that's happening with that, or?
Yeah, I can speak a little on that. I don't do work on the Tar Lake Plume. That is a super fund plume, but the division I work with, the Lansing, we have a super fund component. So they actually is how the EPA funnels the money to the state and works with them. And I think Len's company might work on that site too. So he might have a little headline too. But I do know that they had a meeting here, November, was it November time? They had a meeting in EPA. If you guys remember, we had another meeting with the EPA COVID time. And they were gonna come and do a big response, and now they're picking that back up, and they're gonna, I don't know what their time frame is on that. Do you know what
I
time
don't know
frame?
the time
You
frame.
only know because you went to the meeting.
I think it's this year.
Yeah.
And EPA,
Like 100,000.
Tons, yeah,
yeah,
Something like that of soil and replace it.
yeah,
And be prepared to see all the different.
yeah.
Trucks going in and out of there.
yeah.
So I think they got some of their funding together, and I think what they're gonna do too is maybe have another meeting again. So yeah, that's. Yeah,
Yeah, and one of the things that what we do for the state, so at that site is, it's a different contaminant. It's a petroleum creosote derived product, right, from the wood treatment. And so that type of material breaks down, it's also naturally occurring. So that type of material, there's a lot of microbes that can break that material down in the ground. So we run an air sparge, so we blow air into the ground, gives it oxygen. They need oxygen to effectively degrade it. And so there's an air sparge curtain. So what the EPA is going to do is continue to remove the source, and the air sparge curtain was designed so that any contaminants that flow away get treated before they flow off site. So they're going to expand that air sparge curtain a little bit and then do the really big digger. But I think they want to develop that property as part
it's
of it.
part of the
right?
industrial part.
Yeah,
Property. In that plume, the plume that comes off at Tar Lake is a very small plume. And then once it comes off, it's really aesthetic. irony, but it's not a carcinogen like TCE, which is huge and keeps migrating,
Right, so it can cause your
you know.
white siding to turn orange when you sprinkle, that kind of thing, right? But not necessarily a big health effect. Any more?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? I appreciate it. I mean, I learned new stuff that I thought was pretty close, so thank you.
Thanks. So if you're ever interested in more stuff, like I said, you can just go to the library and there's reports. You can grab them, take them home with you. It's because I, keep going, or let me know when I get it to electronic version. But the big ones are good because they have the big maps and you can really point out and do stuff. But yeah, so if you need any more, just give me a call. Oh, this was a presentation that we did April time last year for in Traverse City for a real estate group of real estate agents that, yeah,
So we had some
So,
additional stuff at the end.
yeah.
but-
So, but that was good. If you want to flip back to that, can you flip back to that site that talked about our mapper? Because our mapper program, that would be a very good thing for, like, you were having questions about other sites in the area or anything. We have a mapper for the state of Michigan, and you can look and see what sites we have, both 201, 213. And it'll also talk about,
There you
it'll
go.
also pull it up, and you pull it up aerially, and then there's different drop down boxes, so you can go up over here. I told you 100 times. You can go down, and you can talk about storage tank sites, then there's sites of the part 201 like this is, brownfield sites. If we have any land use restrictions, which, you might have a deed restriction on a property, so there's different things, but you can do it any place in the state of Michigan and break it down and see what's going on in your neighborhood.
I think about involving education, mission, but that's really, people that. Yeah.
And we know more answers.
We're looking more for sure.